Hail friends, welcome to the channel. Bob here, and welcome to a video talking about indie MMOs, or indie classic MMOs to be more precise. But that's generally what the indie MMO market is mostly, so that's where we're going. I kind of feel that, many of you will have your own opinions on where things are and whatnot. And I will talk about the polls I did at the end of the video because I think that's quite eye-opening. But essentially, for me, indie MMOs have been in a cycle of failure now for a period of time. I know failure is a tough word. How are you defining it? Well, I'm defining it by the fact that when something is no longer playable or usable for its intended purpose or design, and the population has reached a point in these games really where they're not playable as MMOs anymore. And even if you go onto some of the forums and discords, occasionally someone will put up a post saying, you know, I can't play the game as an MMO. You know, I'm essentially logging in and playing it as a single player game because the population is not high enough to support the game from a grouping point of view, like crafting, selling, like the market, whatever it may be. It's just not viable. So that's how I'm defining it, and this is pretty consistent across most time zones, unless maybe if you're one of those players that plays within the golden hour of prime time, you know, or you've got like a pre-made group where you always log in at certain times in a week and play. Well, that's great, but I think for the majority of people, that's not the case. And I don't think an MMO shouldn't only be playable as an MMO during peak times. Obviously, it makes sense that there'll be more people playing. But I've even seen this excuse used by like some dev teams and community managers and stuff, where someone will go in Discord and say, you know, I'm logged in at this time, and there's literally like single digit numbers people logged in, and someone from the team will say, oh well, it's not prime time, you know, it's kind of off peak. I don't think that's an excuse. Obviously, there's going to be a difference, but unless you kind of market your game at prime time only, then I don't really think you can use that as an excuse. It should be operational. Even a small indie MMO should be operational to a certain extent. You know, even off peak. I personally don't think that's unreasonable. You know, maybe you disagree. But essentially, yes, we're not just talking about like off-peak times here. I mean, I did an experiment where over the last 6 months or so, I've been logging into MMOs that I played, keeping an eye on numbers, how many people are playing them, etc. And it's very small, going through most of the day. As I said, unless you're playing like in some prime time golden hour where you can get a group, you know, unless you're doing that, the games are essentially very, very, very difficult to play as an MMO. And as I said, I logged in for different times. I didn't just pick off peak. I stayed logged into games to make sure that I was getting a fair representation of what was going on. Going through to peak times. Obviously, as you go through to peak times, the population's increased. But when you're coming from, like one game particularly, the last game I played, when you're coming from like 8 or 9 players off peak, even if 4, 3, 4, 5 times more people logged in, you're still not really, which was kind of the case. Not always. You know, sometimes the population would stay in the 20s or whatever it was. But unless you're, even if you times that population by, as I said, 4 or 5, you're still not really getting to a point where it's operational as an MMO. And particularly when, like, I think one of the reasons that MMOs are in this state is because they're almost offering no quality of life stuff that classic MMOs offered. It's almost like the trend is to stubbornly design these games so they're even more grindy and more horrible to play, essentially, as a classic MMO player than classic MMOs were. But that's what I've been seeing when I've been logging in over the last 6 months in different games in different times, is that there is just an issue with the population. And as I said, if you go sometimes on Discord or forums or whatever, you know, a player will say, I've logged into your game and I just can't play it as an MMO. I'm essentially logging in and playing it as a single player game. So why is this happening? Well, I think generally we're in agreement as to why it's happening, looking at the polls that I did. As to why it's happening, what the root cause is, we'll try and get into that. But I think there are lots of different reasons. You know, some of them you've mentioned to me before, and some other players may find them superficial. But I don't particularly. If you don't play a game because you don't like the graphics, then you don't like the graphics, and it's going to break your immersion, and you're not going to enjoy the game. I think that's fine. There are lots of different reasons as to why someone may not play a game. But the three core ones that the polls kind of seem to show, how I've been feeling, and certainly how many of you have been feeling as well when I've been talking to you about it, I think there's three core things. I think the first of all is leveling speed or progression speed. Now, when I'm talking about progression, I'm not talking about getting to level 50 in a day or whatever it may be. It's funny because you've kind of got this cut-off point with certain classic MMO players as to what they regard as a classic MMO, and if it goes too far one way towards speed of progression or quality of life stuff, whatever it may be, it then doesn't become a classic MMO. Well, I actually feel that you have to have the same, you have to stick with the same logic if you go the other way. So if you have a classic MMO and the barometer swings too far to the left, to a point where it's no longer a classic MMO, fine. But I think if the barometer swings too far to the right, clockwise, whatever, and it becomes too grindy and too hard, well, I think that's also then not a classic MMO. Making it harder or more grindy doesn't make it more of a classic MMO. It makes it something different, and I think that's the whole issue I've had when I've sounded frustrated in videos and stuff, is that market it correctly. Don't tell us it's a classic MMO if it's not. If you're aiming for something different, I don't even want to know if it's going to be inspired by EverQuest or whatever it may be, because when you do that, we have certain expectations as players. I'm not saying that a game has to meet all of those expectations, but when you talk about EverQuest, there's going to be certain parameters that we're going to expect. Reasonable parameters within the context of a classic MMO, and I think that's fine. I think that's absolutely fine to have those, and I think if your game is not going to meet them, then I kind of really feel that you need to be telling us that up front. But yes, I just feel that a game can move out of the group of a classic MMO, the descriptive of that, if it goes one way towards quality of life and leveling speed or whatever it may be, whatever that may be. But I also think it then moves out of the classic descriptive if it goes the other way. So if you make it too hard and too grindy, it's essentially becomes something else. And I think that's kind of where we are. I think that's the reason these games are failing, because there seems to be a trend in classic MMO development to make the games much more harder. Not harder, actually just more time consuming and more grindy. Everything's taking a lot longer. And it does seem to be a trend. And what also seems to be a trend is some of the mechanics as well. Like even in some of the newer games like Monster Memories and whatever it may be, games that are not out yet, there are certain ideas in those games that are very much part of what we're seeing from a trend point of view in classic MMOs in other games that we've seen. I'm not saying that it's plagiarism or that they're copying or whatever it may be, but there are definitely certain trends that we're seeing up to a point actually where it can almost feel that these developers are talking to each other and kind of using each other's ideas. But maybe we'll get into that kind of a little bit later. So I think the first one is leveling speed and progression speed. Now I'm talking about leveling your character through the game to end game, whatever it may be. These games have essentially got to a point where the leveling speed is so slow that people are just not even willing to engage with it past a certain point. I've had that with some games. You've said exactly the same thing to me, because the thing is, it's not so much about the leveling speed. Say when you're level 50, say you're in the mid-teens. So a friend of the channel was playing Pantheon, and they were in the mid-teens, and they had an 8-hour session killing blues and even cons, I think they said, and it was a solid session. They were killing for a lot of that time, or it's how they reported it to me anyway. And an 8-hour session at level 14 or 15 or whatever it was, they gained 15% experience. Now, this is not 1,500% experience or 15,000. This is an 8-hour session in the mid-teens, and you gain 15% experience. I've never come across anything so ridiculous, to be quite frank. And as I said, Pantheon is not an outlier. This is happening in other games. Embers Adrift is exactly the same thing. You can get to mid-teens and then you end up spending God knows how much time killing mobs before you see any progression. Now I'm comparing all of this obviously to EverQuest. Now EverQuest from a classic MMO perspective is considered the most grindy. It's notorious for it to a certain to a certain extent, particularly amongst players who've never played it before, like new players, maybe like World of Warcraft players or whatever it may be. It's kind of not really. I think it got that reputation because it was amongst classic MMOs, but what we're seeing now is MMOs that are going far beyond that. So EverQuest is kind of like a bit easy, really, actually, in comparison. And coming back to EverQuest, it's made me, after playing some of these games, it's made me realise how much I appreciate EverQuest and appreciate the design. Because what EverQuest does from a levelling point of view is that wherever you are, I mean, obviously in vanilla, you know, if you pick a Troll Shadow Knight, then you're going to be in a certain world, certain world of pain, but nowhere near as much pain as you would be if you were playing Embers Adrift or Pantheon, for example, as it was. I think maybe there was a patch that addressed the Pantheon XP thing, but I don't know how much it addressed it. I can't imagine it's drastically changed it so that it's like EverQuest, for example. But even playing a classic MMO in vanilla, even playing EverQuest vanilla and choosing a Troll Shadow Knight, these new MMOs are still many, many times slower to level than that was. And if you can imagine that, well, you know, I find the situation with a levelling speed quite ridiculous. As I said, I'm focusing on levelling speed. I'm not talking about being able to get to the end game as quickly as possible. I'm not talking about going around, you know, soloing raid bosses or whatever it may be. I'm talking about levelling progression speed, and I'm comparing it to EverQuest, and these games have just gone far beyond that. Since coming back to EverQuest, the amazing thing that EverQuest does is that you get a constant feedback loop of progression. And it's weird because I listen to some people, quite young people actually. I do feel that there's hopefully a minority of classic MMO players who have got this like small man mentality or midlife crisis type mentality, you know, in their early 20s, because you see them going on about they kind of wear their classic MMO credentials as a badge of honour, even though it's clear they don't understand classic MMOs at all. I've seen some of them literally who seem to be in their early 20s going, oh, back in the day. And I'm thinking, hang on a minute, like, what? I mean, you're just trying to sound like you fit in, when really you never would have played EverQuest back in the day. You probably wouldn't have been born back in the day. I do find it quite interesting and quite weird as well, this kind of stuff. But then I guess you get that kind of like willy waving, you know, I drive a Porsche, you drive a Fiat, in any hobby, don't you? I guess it's just one of those things. And I've seen some streams, like a couple of Pantheon streams, for example, where there's some players saying, oh, I want it to be even harder and more grindy. I want it to be more classic. Clearly not. No idea what they're talking about, because it's already far from classic. So saying you want it to be more classic is not correct. I saw it in Embers Adrift as well, where there are people that wanted certain mechanics and systems to be even more obnoxious, more grindy, and they would say more classic, but they weren't more classic. You know, it's just more grindy to a point where it takes it outside of the classic area, the classic kind of sphere, I guess. But that's I think that's the first issue. That is levelling speed. And as I was, before I kind of keep interrupting myself, what I was going to say was that EverQuest gives you a constant feedback loop. So even if you've got, like, even if you play a class now in Velius where the class penalties have gone, even if you play a race with a bit of a penalty, you're still getting a constant feedback loop of progression. So you kill a mob, you know, we've got UIs now that tell us how much XP we get percentage-wise, roughly, per kill, and you essentially get 1% per kill. The game is designed to constantly be giving you progression, like, as I said, feedback progression loop is constantly telling you that you're making progress. It is slow progress in comparison to like a modern MMO, but the progress is still there, and it's not about leveling fast. It's not about wanting to get to the end game. It's not about not enjoying the leveling process or the game as you level up. It's about certain parameters, a certain mechanic that we're used to as classic MMO players. And these classic these indie MMOs have gone far outside of that parameter, to a point where the leveling speed is not just one. It's not just like 2, 3, or 4 times more slower. It's ridiculously slower, to a point where my mind's kind of boggled a bit as to who's making these design decisions and why they're making them, why they want people to level so slowly. I've seen some pretty weak arguments about how it's not about the destination, it's the journey, and like leveling, you know, spending 6 months in one zone to level up to get out of that zone is immersive, and it means you see more of the world, you explore more of the world. That's rubbish. You know, people have got a limit, and classic MMO players have got a limit. EverQuest players who are used to it are used to grinding, have got a limit, and these games are far outside that. But as I said, as you know, the point I'm trying to make is that these games don't even remotely resemble EverQuest from a progression feedback loop, where you kill a mob and the game feeds back to you that you're making progress. It's funny because progress has almost become a dirty word for certain. You know, these like I'm a hardcore kind of MMO player, look at my badge kind of type players. You know, it's weird now how it is, and how so far away their memories or their opinions are of what a classic MMO is. But yes, it's all about having an experience that's reasonably similar to what you would expect, as I said, within the parameters of the classic MMO, and we're nowhere near that. But again, you know, EverQuest did so many things perfect. It's done this perfect as well. You know, they realise that you obviously want feedback. You know, when you're leveling, you want feedback. Because I was talking about this on a Monsters Memory stream, and someone was saying, "Oh, why do you want to get to the end level? You know, why do you want to get there quickly? You know, why not just enjoy the experience?" And you know, and again, it's kind of a bit of a gaslight, really. It doesn't really make any sense, because I wasn't saying that I want to get to the end level quickly. What I'm saying is I want to get to the end level in a time that is reflective of the era that the games are trying to replicate, essentially. I don't think there's anything unreasonable about that. Particularly, as I said, but to go back to what I said before, particularly when you consider that the EverQuest, for example, is considered grindy anyway. So making it more grindy, yeah, it's not about getting to the end level as quickly as possible and skipping all the content or whatever it may be. It's about leveling in a reasonable time, and making progress in a reasonable time. I mean, when I used to play, people always use like Dungeons and Dragons as an example. Well, I used to play D&D with a group of blokes, and we'd sit around once or twice a week. We'd order pizza and kebabs, you know, and Coke, and we'd sit there and we'd have a laugh, talking, playing the game. But we were always thinking about progress. And at the end of the session, you know, the DM would give out the experience that we'd gain for that you know, for that session, and we'd look at the magic items we got, if any, and whatever it may be. I mean, our DM was like super hardcore stingy, but we were still interested in progression, you know, because that's what an RPG is all about. An RPG is about progression. That's the whole point. You know, your character progresses and goes forward. And I think psychologically, there's a speed and there's a point where if it becomes too slow, you know, you lose interest. You just give in. And as I said, you know, we're not looking at super duper speeds, and we're trying to get to the end game as quickly as possible. You know, you can have an idea in mind as to how quickly you should, or the leveling should take, but still enjoy the process. I mean, I've enjoyed the process of leveling my warrior in EverQuest, and I feel like I've made reasonable progress. They have had an XP bonus this weekend, as you would expect, you know, July the 4th. And I've gained about 4 levels. And I would probably say that outside of like special occasions, I'm sure that classic MMOs, I'm sure the indie MMOs might have special occasions as well, where they do like an XP bonus thing. But outside of, I would say that I probably leveled a bit too quickly. But as I said, it was an XP bonus. And I've turned in some quest items as well, which has also kind of given me a bump. But outside of that, you know, the leveling process has been pretty much perfect, because again, as I said, the game is always feeding back to you. It's always telling you that you're making progress. Progress is not a dirty word as a minority of so-called classic MMO players seem to think it is. I think it's a load of old bollocks, to be honest. But there you go. That's just me. But it's I mean, looking at the polls and looking at well, you know, my own experiences and listening to what you've had to say about it, you know, it's definitely a big issue, and I think it's one of the biggest issues as to why we're not playing. You know, as I'll go back to what I was saying before about a role-playing game. You always want to be making progress to a certain extent, because progress allows you to experience new things, you know, fight new mobs, go to new areas, go to new dungeons, engage in different mechanics in the game, get different items to drop. As I said, that's what the RPG is about. An RPG is about your character making progress. And if that progress is too slow, I just think we're just not interested, and we're just rejecting it, and that's exactly what's happening. The other thing, the second one, and these two are kind of quite linked about soloing and grouping. So one of the things the poll shows is that 98% of you think that an MMO you should be able to make reasonable solo progress in an MMO. Don't listen to all the people that say, oh, it's not a classic MMO, it's an MMO, you're supposed to play it with other people. Classic MMOs were always very soloable, even EverQuest. Ultra Online was supremely slowable. You know, I had my Bard and my Tamer would go around clearing all the content that was available, and it never damaged that game. You know, that game is still played today by a number of people, and there are some emulated servers as well for people that like that kind of, you know, top-down perspective, quite very detailed kind of world that Ultima Online offered. You know, people are still playing that game. EverQuest, very soloable. I remember back when I used to play in Classic, when it first came out, you know, I had some friends who would level. Enchanter was one of them, Shaman was another one. Also Necromancer I knew, Druid. You know, I know these are all the soloable classes, but I think we've come to the conclusion now with all the knowledge we've got that you can pretty much solo any class you want in EverQuest. Some of them are just harder than others, obviously. But when you're on a mature server, it's not a problem because people will always buff you and stuff to make progress easier. So yeah, you know, these games have always been very soloable by a number of classes. It was never a dirty word, solo. And the thing is as well is that the developers obviously realise this, because why wouldn't you? What sort of smeghead creates a multiplayer game, creates an MMO, but then tries to alienate probably the biggest, well, certainly on my poll, the biggest portion of the audience? What sort of marketing business brainiac move is that? You know, and classic MMOs realise that. EverQuest realised it. When you create a character on vanilla EverQuest, the class description, when you click on it, tells you how good it is at soloing or grouping. You know, for some classes it will say, you know, this class is okay to solo for a time, but it operates better in a group. Some classes it will say this class is good at grouping and soloing. Some classes it will say, you know, this class is good at soloing. This is vanilla EverQuest telling you, because of course they would. Why wouldn't you? It's logical. You know, why would you tell a portion of the audience not to buy your game? Stupid. And actually it's quite arrogant. Like the hubris is unbelievable for some of these games where they're kind of telling a certain population of the majority of the audience that this game is not for you. I find it quite ridiculous, really. But yes, you know, actually the Necromancer was described as the solo class officially. That's the official description. It was designed that way. But what's brilliant about EverQuest and the design of EverQuest is that later on, as time went by, people discovered that other classes were better than the solo class, and that's great. People worked out how to play classes, and you use their toolboxes to the absolute ultimate. And there were some classes that can solo more. That's great. Your game should have that. I'm sick of these. I'm sick of games like becoming obsessed with balance and all that kind of rubbish. Even single player games have become obsessed with balance. You know, in a single player RPG. I mean, like Cyberpunk. I mean, I used to play Cyberpunk a lot, and my favourite build, I guess, was probably like the Cyberdeck one. But the Cyberdecks like went through it must have been a half a dozen balance patches to try and balance them. It's a single player RPG. It's ridiculous, and it's also, I find it quite ridiculous in MMOs as well. You know, where so much time seems to go into homogenising the classes, when in classic MMOs it just wasn't that way. There were just some classes that were better at stuff than other classes. You know, and it didn't matter, and it didn't damage the game. Like being able to solo in EverQuest never damaged the game, and Enchanter's being able to solo. You know, group content, dungeon content, whatever it may be, never damaged the game. In fact, it made it more interesting. It made the gameplay more emergent because of how certain classes were designed. And people are still enjoying the games today. And if that doesn't tell you something, then, well, I really don't know what to say to you. But yeah, the whole point of this was the soloing to grouping. You know, MMOs have always been soloable, even classic ones, even EverQuest. But we've reached a point now where there's an enforced grouping thing. Soloing is almost becoming something that's trying to be pushed out. Some games are actually saying that the whole aim of them is for grouping, and you pretty much can't make any progress from a solo point of view. Even in groups in some of these games, the progress is chronically slow anyway. So I would not recommend you go and play them if you haven't tried them, because even as a group, the leveling progress is so slow. But it's depressingly slow solo. It's not even that you can probably find a group in these games anyway. But yeah, this whole solo group thing and this force group thing, and the fact that, you know, this kind of like I don't know, this, you know, this, as I said, this classic MMO badge wearing minority attitude towards soloing was never a thing. Because the developers were smart, they knew that why the hell would you create a game that was so limited with regards to a player's ability to make progress. And I'm actually talking about leveling progress here. I don't think that people should be able to solo, you know, raid content or whatever. I obviously, I think everyone probably agrees, it feels the same as me. You know, an MMO should have content that is only intended for raiding or even grouping. If a class works out how to solo the group stuff, I don't care about that. And I don't want to see loads of balancing to stop that or nerfing. But at the end of the day, I think that, yes, there should be content that's aimed at raiding and groups. And the progress I'm talking about is being able to log in, and if you can't find a group, you can make some progress solo. And that's what classic MMOs did, because it makes sense. Why would you not? You know, it just seems like a no-brainer. And there's this force grouping thing going on, as I said, where some of the games are kind of well, they're saying you can only make progress in a group. I'm not hearing a lot of this. I'm not hearing a lot of these mechanics and systems discussed too much before the game comes out. It's almost like they're letting people buy the game first, and for the players to work it out for themselves. And I find it slightly dishonest. If you're selling the game as a classic MMO or as a game that's inspired by EverQuest or whatever it may be, I think people need to be honest up front. But that's okay. We'll end this bit here because it's kind of dragging on. But so, as I said, you know, to sum up, from my own point of view and from what everyone is saying, who's interacted with in the polls that I did, which you can look at on the channel. If you go to the channel and you click on community, you can see the polls. Yeah. And for the people that I've spoken to when I played the games, in-game, out-game, whatever it may be, I think we're generally on the same page. And I think overall it's just that there are certain parameters and systems that are classic, and we're going to expect those. And if you design your game so that your game, your systems, your progress, whatever it may be, falls out way outside of those parameters, I'm afraid it's not a classic MMO anymore, and you've kind of marketed it at the wrong audience. And I think that's not a good thing. The other thing as well is that there are some systems that have been introduced that were kind of never really in classic MMOs. You've got this like whack-a-mole type thing with the nodes as you run around the world looking for nodes. It's a horrible system. It just creates more roadblocks. I think that's the issue as well. Like probably the fourth problem are roadblocks as well. So some games are kind of taking the EverQuest death penalty system and adding extra penalties to it. Things don't really make any sense from a gameplay fun point of view. Some of them are just adding more barriers in the way in general from a gameplay loop point of view. The gameplay loop I'll talk about a little bit about. I know this video is going on a bit, but I think it's quite important. The gameplay loop in EverQuest is you run around killing mobs. And you know what? When I go out for a session, and most of my sessions, I'm kind of very addicted to EverQuest at the moment, and most of my sessions are probably like 6 hours or so. When I go out to do a session, that's it. I don't have to come back. Nothing's breaking up my gameplay loop. I can go out and play to my heart's content, then come back again. The only systems you need to interact with as a player to go out and enjoy your game are very, very light survival systems, should we call them. So for my warrior, it's food. I buy a stack of 20 food, which is a stack. It's dirt cheap, costs hardly anything at all. I can go out and I can do a 6-hour session or so. And at the end of that session, I've still got some food left over. It's left over. My food requirement doesn't make me constantly have to go to town to refill. If I want to shoot an arrow, I can buy some arrows if I want to. If I want to bind wound, I can bind wound if I want to. But again, we're talking like pennies really to buy this stuff. It's not an issue. And those are the only obstacles to my gameplay loop for the day. and there isn't really anything that stops me from enjoying the game, unless I get to a point where maybe I'm really, really full up and I need to go and turn stuff in or change up my coin or whatever it may be. But that's not something that I have to worry about for too much. Maybe once or twice in that 6-hour session. MMOs now are putting more and more systems and mechanics in place that take you out of your gameplay loop. Embers Adrift is a perfect example of this. When I was playing Embers Adrift, I would leave town after sorting out these problems that the game was putting in front of me, and pretty much within an hour these problems had resurfaced and I would have to go and deal with some of them again. I don't understand, again, from a design point of view, where you know, you're a player, you're in a group, and you go to a dungeon, and you get into that dungeon within a very, very short space of time. The game systems are asking you to leave the game again. You know, they're saying, right, you've got to break up your gameplay loop, you've got to go and deal with these problems. I don't get it. It just seems very weird. And again, there just seems to be arbitrary roadblocks put in the way just to slow you down and frustrate you. And arbitrary roadblocks is one of the things on the polls that you really, really don't like. And I absolutely agree with you. But just from a design point of view, I don't understand why you want your players to keep stopping their gameplay. You know, to have things in place that stop their gameplay. EverQuest has got those, but they're very light. You go out, and it's not really something you need to worry about. Pretty much, you know, buy a stack of food before you leave, food and drink, and that's all you need to worry about, essentially. The only other obstacle you're going to get, which is, of course, you know, there's got to be some risk reward. The only obstacle you're going to get during your gameplay time is if you die and you're going to do a corpse recovery. But now we've got games adding in extra punishments for a corpse recovery, which I never really understood. I mean, dying and losing experience and having to get your corpse back, that's 3 punishments, essentially. So, and I think we come to accept that. But then we're in a situation where games are adding more on to make things even more frustrating. And I think that, I mean, as I've said this before, I like a game, any game, to pose problems as long as it provides solutions. But I think there is a limit to the problems, I think, that we're willing to deal with. And if these are problems that are just making us take even more time than, as I said, what we would expect from a classic MMO, or if they're breaking up our gameplay loop when classic MMOs just did not do this, then, you know, I think that we're out, essentially. But that's another point as well. The fourth point is that these games are putting more obstacles and issues in the way that we're spending more and more time solving these problems. Certainly with Embers Adrift, that's how I felt. You know, I felt that I was spending more time actually solving the issues the game was putting in front of me than actually enjoying the game. And I think that's a real issue. But anyway, let's move on to like why this is happening. Well, first of all, it seems to be a trend. A lot of these MMOs now are starting to feel kind of suspiciously similar. You know, even the ones that are still in development that are not released yet. A lot of the systems are very, very similar. As I said, this whack-a-mole stuff with collecting nodes and whatnot. I mean, that's not a fun system. The issue with that system, I think, more than anything, is the fact that you're in a situation where there's not enough stuff. Do you know what I mean? You know, there's not actually enough nodes for you to interact with. So if you want to do crafting, again, this seems to be something that's done on purpose. Like if you want to craft, you know, you're limited. You're limited again as to how many people are playing, etc., etc., etc. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't get it. I don't know why there's this insistence on having these systems. Apart from the fact that running around desperately looking for a node that someone else hasn't picked up. I mean, I've seen ridiculous situations where you've got more than one person waiting at a node, and as soon as it spawns, you know, whoever clicks on it the first. You know, whoever's connection has got the best ping or whatever. It's just, is that a fun way of playing a game? It's not really, and there's no real reason for it either. You know, you don't need to limit resources if your crafting system is designed in the right way. New World did a lot of things wrong. One of the things it did right was its gathering and crafting system. So you walk out the town in New World, you see a group of trees, a little forest or whatever it may be. You go over there and you can chop the trees. You're not running around looking for a node that someone else hasn't picked up. You've got whole areas that make logical sense, you know, on certain types of ground, where you can pick up, you know, where you can mine iron ore, for example. It's not a problem. And if I logged into New World now, as I do now and again, and I go to the auction house, the tier 1 resources are always in demand. They're always buy orders for just green wood and iron ore. The reason for that is because you need those tier 1 resources to create tier 2 resources. You need tier 2 to create tier 3. There's always a demand. The reasoning that it doesn't flood the market with this stuff and it creates a market for it is rubbish. If your crafting system is designed correctly, there's always a desire for tier 1 resources, and there's no need to roadblock people who want to do crafting by having a small amount of nodes scattered around the world, and you've got this frustration where everyone's fighting over them. Why are we fighting over nodes? I don't get it. It doesn't help the market if you design your system in the right way. There's always going to be a market there, assuming you've done your homework and you know how to design a good system. So I just don't get it. It creates this competitive nature in a PvE environment where people don't really want that type of gameplay. If we're honest with us, I mean, I know I've spoken to a lot of you who have looked at Ashes of Creation and said, I really like the looks of it, but I'm not going to play it because I just don't want that competitive nature. That player against player thing. I mean, certain NPC, certain MMOs, of course, will have PvP servers, and I can understand in a PvP server because you can fight with other players over the nodes. It makes logical gameplay sense. But in a PvE game, I think it's stupid. I think it's another arbitrary roadblock to stop people from gathering and crafting. And also, I kind of feel the node system very immersion breaking. Like you're running around, you're running past all these trees looking for a certain node. It just breaks immersion. It doesn't look very good either, with these horrible blobs just randomly sticking out of the ground. I don't understand why someone hasn't made a zone out of it. Why don't you create like a dungeon zone that's a mine? So it's an adventure zone and it's a gathering zone. So you go there, you kill some mobs, maybe you clear around. There's loads of nodes for everyone if they want them. Yeah, and it's kind of like it's like a gameplay area as well. So you're killing two birds with one stone. Why not create a forested area with mobs? And when I say mobs to kill, I'm not talking about blocking players from gathering. I'm just talking about normal mobs that you clear and you do some gathering, and it's a fun experience. You could create a forest where all the trees are choppable, are gatherable from. You got mobs wandering around. That's kind of like your risk reward type thing. I don't understand why we're not doing that. I don't understand again, but I understand it's probably cheap, and maybe it's the most efficient way of doing it. But when every game's doing it, it gets to a point where you start to notice other systems that feel the same as well, and so it gets to a point where it almost feels as though everyone's just copying everyone else. So yeah, that's not fun. I don't understand why. If someone wants to log in for an hour and go around gathering and crafting and do that, I don't know why we would stop them doing that by creating these roadblocks in place. I don't get it. And as I said, refer to New World to see how to design a system where the market is never flooded with tier 1 stuff, because it's always required to make progress through to the higher tier resources. But that's finished with that now. I've spent too much time on that. We'll quickly cover as to why it's probably happening. Well, overall, the developers seem to be out of touch with what the classic audience wants. Now, you could say that maybe this new indie MMO genre, subgenre, is a new genre, and they're creating their own thing, and that's fine. But then you need to tell us that. Don't tell us that you're creating a game inspired by EverQuest, then we play it, and it's clearly not. It's so far on the barometer. It's so far the other way that it's not anymore a classic MMO than games that have become too easy in some people's opinion. I just feel that that's the fairest thing to do. Just let us know what the game is going to consist of, what you're aiming for. If you're saying EverQuest, then we're going to expect certain things. But I think the developers just seem out of touch with what the player base wants. I mean, it's all very well to say, it's for a niche audience, etc., etc. But I kind of thought that the classic MMO audience was the niche audience. So it was a niche audience. So if that audience is rejecting your game, then you get people say, it's very niche, ultra niche, uber niche. That's rubbish. Why would you create a game and then not expect it, and then not want an audience almost, or only limiting it to an audience of a certain type. And I think, I mean, so I'm sure that the argument, and it's a fair argument, could be made as to say that, well, it's their game, they can do what they want, and that's fine. You know, they absolutely can. But tell us what you're doing up front. And also, I agree with that to a point. But when your game reaches a point where the people who are loyally sticking to your game, still playing it, are encountering these issues, then I actually think that you need to move your parameters. You need to change your design. You know, because the few players remaining that are still playing your game are having problems and are letting you know, and you're just not doing anything about it. I think this comes up to ultimately what the issue is. I think it's an out of touch development, and also a development that's not willing to take any responsibility or accountability. We all remember Chris's like classic streams back in the day for Shroud of the Avatar, where, you know, some people would troll him because they just like to see him go off, and he would always go off about anything really. But even when he got pushback about game design, he would go off, and it was everyone else's fault. For him, it was always the Unreal Engine's fault, I think it was, or Unity. I can't remember. I think it might have been Unity. It's always Unity's fault, but it was also like players' fault, content creators' fault, websites' fault, whatever it may be. It was never him. He would never take accountability for the state or the situation the game was in. And you see that coming through now. Like I was on a Discord for a game a couple of months ago, and someone put up an article from MMORPG, and I read the article first because I thought to myself, well, it must be quite bad, looking at the reaction. But it wasn't really. It wasn't like, oh, this game's shit. It was just pointing out issues that we've all pointed out about with the game, and where the game is. Nothing wrong with that. It wasn't positive, but it was just pointing out the reality of the situation. But one of the developers actually said, oh, well, this is partly why a game's not doing well. No, you need to take responsibility and accountability. The reason your game's not doing well is because of you and the decisions that you have made. You can't keep blaming everyone else for the problem. It's not a marketing problem. I mean, some of the biggest MMO content creators have done videos based on some of these indie MMO games. The most recent one, for the most recent MMO that I played, the indie MMO that I played, I think he got something like 250 to 300,000 views. And the video was quite positive actually as well. Actually, I thought it was very positive. And that person, I think Lazy Peon, he quite liked the game. So it's not marketing, because your game's had a ton of exposure. It's not content. You've added content. It's still the same. It's not a content creator's fault or a nasty player's fault or a website's fault or an engine's fault. You know, you need to take accountability. If your game is in the situation it's in where people can't play it as an MMO, it's solely down to you. And if you're if you stubbornly want to stick to your design, so if things carry on as they are, well, then that is also down to you. You know, ultimately it's your problem. And I don't like this thing where where they're not taking accountability for the issues and just blaming everyone else. It's clear it's the systems in the game. That's what people have bounced off of. And I feel it's I don't feel it's a particularly good thing to be doing that. Blaming, it's very much a cultural thing at the moment where it's everyone else's fault. Oh, we've created this Star Wars, but this Star Wars we've created, we're not aiming it at the Star Wars audience, we're aiming it at a new audience. No one watches it. Oh, you're all bigots because you didn't watch it. Well, no. We're Star Wars fans. We want Star Wars. Simple as that. If you're not going to give us that, well, we're not going to watch it. It's the same with this. You know, same with this. You know, fine. You know, if there's a group of developers that want to create a new MMO subgenre, then that's fine. But it's also fine that we reject them and then we tell you why we're rejecting them, or we create content and tell you why. It's all fair is fair. But that's it. I think that's ultimately the issue as to why this is happening. I think that development seems to be doesn't seem to really have much to relate to a classic MMO, the systems and mechanics that are being put in place, and there's no accountability. It's always someone else's fault, and I don't think that's right. You know, I think that, as I said, I'm repeating myself now, but there you go. Well, there we are. I don't see things changing unless development teams sit down and say, okay, our game's got a problem. The audience is too small. What can we do about it? As opposed to just blaming everyone else. I think that until that happens, I don't think things will change. I think we'll be stuck in this loop of failure, really, which is what it is, because these games are not operating as intended at the moment. And I don't see it changing going forward either. Like some of the games I've played that are not out yet, that are in alpha or pre-alpha or whatever it may be. You know, they're making similar mistakes. You know, they're including systems in their game that us as classic MMO players have already bounced off of. We've already told you this is not what we want, but you're just going ahead and copying what the other games are doing. It does kind of defy logic almost. I do find it odd. Yeah, but there you go. That's it. The polls kind of reflect this, as I said, like 98. I'll have a quick look at the polls for you, the ones that seem quite relevant to this video. 98% of you think that you should be able to make reasonable progress solo. And I'm talking about leveling progress. I'm not talking about soloing this whole area here, killing all the mobs, getting all the loot. I'm talking about leveling progress solo. And by reasonable, the caveat I put on the question, or the parameters I put on the question were EverQuest progress. And as we've all seen, leveling in EverQuest gives you constant feedback about your progress. It's not fast speed, it's just classic EverQuest speed. We don't want it all at once, we just want something similar to that. And 98% of you think that it's important that the game's got it, essentially. 40% of you thought it was a deal breaker. So I guess if it hasn't got it, you're not going to play it. And I guess that's where a large portion of the population that started these MMOs have gone. They've stopped playing it. The other one was interesting around like the community. Nearly 60%, like the biggest option there, nearly 60% was the option of you like the community. You like having a community, obviously, but you like to interact with it when it suits you. So you don't want to be forced into interacting with the community. At the first, I was surprised at that one, but then when you think about it, not really. Like, as human beings, we don't want to be forced to do anything. You know, if I log into the game and I want to interact with the community, that's fine. If I don't want to, I should have the choice not to be able to do that. And classic MMOs did that. As we've seen, you know, like on EverQuest, on P99, on Qualm, you know, like solo self-found has become, and the hardcore solo self-found as well has become quite a big thing. You know, there's people that really enjoy doing that, where they don't interact with the audience at all, just for that particular character, because it's something that they want to do. It's an interesting new system that's becoming quite popular. So yeah, that was also something that I was surprised at. But then when I thought about it, I thought, no, of course, you know, you want to interact with the game systems when you want to. And we log in sometimes. We don't always feel like interacting with other people. Sometimes we just log in for an hour, do a dad camp, and log out again. I think that's the reality of it. The other one I found quite interesting was we're giving MMOs less time. So we're trying a new MMO, and if it's not meeting our requirements, then we're just stopping it. We're stopping playing it very quicker than we were before. And also, many people are kind of not returning to those games. The percentage of people, I think it was about 30%, kind of will, without any kind of feedback. But the other 70% of people are either not returning to an MMO that they stopped playing, and they're stopping playing them quicker. They're giving up on them quicker if the game is not meeting their classic requirements. And there's a larger group of people who will return to a game, you know, if the patch notes or word of mouth suggests that things have changed with regards to the things that drove them away from the game. But as we can see, many of those things are not changing, and they are really not changing. Like, don't be fooled. It's happening on Embers Adrift now as well, but like many years back, there was one or two people who used to come to my Shroud of the Avatar videos every now and again, and they would say, Shroud of the Avatar's had a big patch, everything's different, the game's much better now, etc, etc, etc. When I looked at the patches, and I would always go back and look back over like a 6-month patch period, nothing really had changed with regards to systems as to why I'd stopped playing the game. It's all low-hanging fruit that's not really impactful. And obviously with Shroud of the Avatar, a lot of the changes on patches were either adding cosmetics or fixing cosmetics a lot of the time. Embers Adrift has become the latest game where every 3 months there's the same 1 or 2 people will go to one of my videos and say Embers Adrift have really changed, it's a much better game, etc, etc. So I'll go and look at the patch notes for a few months, and I'll see that from a systems point of view as to why myself and maybe many of you bounced off of that game, the systems are essentially the same, and it's just low-hanging fruit that it kind of disguises. It's kind of classed as the game really changing and whatever, but it's not really. It's just low-hanging fruit stuff. The core systems don't change. So that was quite an interesting one as well. So that seems to be it. You know, like, I guess to sum up, you know, I think that we don't want. It appears as though the vast majority, looking at the games currently of the classic MMO audience, don't want these extra grindy, punishing systems that we're being given. We want to log into the game and we want to have an experience on our own terms, which is the way it always should be. You know, these games shouldn't force you to do a certain thing. Obviously, there are the core basics. It's a role-playing game, so we come into role-playing games expecting to be able to make progress, and we kill mobs to make progress. It's part of the core gameplay. And what I mean by that is logging in and deciding how we do that, and not having all these extra systems and punishments put in place just to waste our time. But anyway, I'm waffling now. I've gone on for far too long. As I said, I don't see it changing, and the game's coming out in the future over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it may be, don't really seem to be breaking the trend. And it doesn't seem as though they're kind of giving us what us as classic MMO players want. Yeah, of course, you know, we all get to play the new MMO and it becomes like the great hope. We go on a Discord and we say, oh, this is the greatest MMO I've ever played, or this is the best experience I've had from EverQuest. I mean, I've actually seen people, the same person, actually, the same 1 or 2 people, say the same thing about every MMO that they play. So obviously there's that honeymoon period where, oh God, you know, there's a new MMO coming out called Killing Dragons and Orcs, and I've played an alpha, pre-alpha, and it's amazing. It's just like EverQuest. All the games have had that feedback initially, but then we all stopped playing them. So, you know, what's going on? I don't know. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll speak to you again soon.